Porsche as a brand has become the stuff of legend over the years. But today I want to tell you how we got here. Now, back in the day, Porsche was a collection of clever engineers led by one particularly clever and some would argue slightly obsessed man, Ferdinand Porsche. Now, Ferdinand was not the kind of man who followed trends. He was the kind of man who looked at the way things were done, scoffed, and then built something completely different, just to prove a point. Now, I love most classic Porsches, as well as the new 911s, but before we get into the history of their flat 6 and the cars like the GT3 RS, let's quickly address the elephant in the room. You see, Porsche's past isn't all sunshine and innovation. Before they became the purveyors of the world's finest sports cars, they had a rather complicated relationship with the Nazis. Ferdinand Porsche, the man behind the brand, wasn't just a brilliant engineer, he was also quite frankly an opportunist who cozied up with the Third Reich when it suited him. I will also say he wasn't alone in this. Many of Germany's great industrialists of the 1930s had a mutually beneficial relationship with Hitler's regime. But Porsche played a particularly key role, helping to create both the people's car and the war machines that followed. You see, it all started in the mid-1930s, when Hitler wanted to motorize Germany. His vision was simple, a cheap, mass-produced car that ordinary Germans could afford, capable of carrying 2 adults and 3 children at 100 km per hour. This is where Ferdinand Porsche comes in. He had been toying with streamlined rear-engine designs for years. His prototype, what we now know as the Volkswagen Beetle, was refined under Nazi funding and shown to the public in 1938 as the KDF Wagen. Now, production of the KDF Wagen never truly got off the ground before the war broke out, but the car's architecture, the rear-mount air-cooled engine and the torsion bar suspension became the foundation for Porsche's later designs, which included the 356 and ultimately the 911. And when Germany plunged into World War II, Porsche, like many other German manufacturers, pivoted to military production. His firm designed and built the Volkswagen Kubenwagen, which was the German equivalent of a Jeep, the Schwimmwagen, an amphibious version, and even some terrifyingly ambitious heavy tanks like the Porsche Tiger, which thankfully never made it past the prototype stage because it was hideously unreliable. This is an ugly part of the company's past, and it's something that Porsche, the modern company, has acknowledged, but it is a stain on the history of this company nonetheless. But as I said earlier, I love the Porsche cars, but that doesn't mean that I agree with what the founder did back in the day. Anyways, after the war, Ferdinand Porsche was arrested for his role in Nazi war production and spent 20 months in a French prison. During this time, his son, Ferry Porsche, took control of the company and set about designing something new, a lightweight rear-engine sports car based on Volkswagen mechanicals. That car became the Porsche 356, the brand's first production model, and the beginning of its sports car dynasty. But as the 1950s rolled on, it became clear that Porsche needed more power. The 356's little 4-cylinder was being pushed to its limits, and while engineers managed to squeeze impressive performance out of it, they knew it was only a matter of time before it hit a wall. So as the 1960s approached, Porsche had a decision to make: stick with the flat 4 and try to eke out every last drop of performance, or go bigger. For a company as small as Porsche, designing an entirely new engine from scratch was no small feat. The logical choice would have been to follow in the footsteps of competitors and move the water-cooled inline-6 for a V8, as many sports car manufacturers were doing at the time. But logic was never really Porsche's strong suit. Instead, they decided that the new car, what would eventually become the 911, needed to stick to what they knew best. That meant a rear-engine layout, it meant air cooling, and it meant keeping things as compact as possible. A flat 6 was the answer. It was an evolution of the flat 4 they had been using in the 356, but with 2 more cylinders for increased displacement and better balance. It also kept the weight low in the car, helping with handling On paper, it seemed like a brilliant idea, but in reality, making it work was going to be a serious engineering challenge. The development of the flat six, internally called the Type 901 engine, began in the early 1960s, led by Porsche's chief engineer, Hans Mesker. Now, Mesker is a name that deserves to be carved into the halls of automotive history, because he wasn't just responsible for this engine, but he would go on to develop some of the greatest engines Porsche would ever build, including the ones that powered the Le Mans winning race cars and the legendary Tag Porsche Formula One engine. But in the early 60s, Mesker had his hands full trying to make the 901 engine work. One of the biggest challenges was cooling. Air-cooled engines were simple and reliable, but they had limitations when it came to heat management, especially in a six-cylinder configuration. Too much heat in the wrong place and the engine would cook itself alive. Porsche's solution was to use an oversized axial fan, a now iconic piece of engineering that sat on top of the engine and shoved air through the cooling fins. It was simple, effective, and gave the engine a distinctive mechanical whir that would become a signature sound of the 911. Another challenge was size. The flat six needed to be compact enough to fit in the rear of a car without upsetting weight distribution. Porsche accomplished this by using a dry sump lubrication system, something typically reserved for race cars, which allowed for a lower engine profile and ensured consistent oil flow, even under high cornering loads. Then there was the question of materials. To keep weight down, Porsche used aluminium for the crankcase and cylinder heads, a decision that was unusual at the time, but helped the engine remain light and rev happy. By 1963, after endless testing and development, the first production-ready version of the Type 901 flat six was ready to go. It displaced 2 liters, produced 130 horsepower, and was a marvel of engineering. With the engine sorted, Porsche needed a car to put it in. The original plan was to name it the Porsche 901, but Peugeot threw a fit and claimed they had exclusive rights to 3-digit car names with a 0 in the middle. Rather than fight the legal battle, Porsche simply changed the name to 911, and just like that, history was made. The first 911 hit the streets in 1964, and while it wasn't an instant success, as some purists still preferred the old 356, it quickly proved itself on the road and track. The flat six gave the car a unique character. It was smooth, it revved beautifully, and it had a soundtrack unlike anything else. Of course, it also meant that the 911 inherited the handling quirks of the rear engine layout. Too much speed into a corner, lift off the throttle, and the rear end would swing around like an angry wasp. But in the hands of a skilled driver, this thing was magic. By the mid-1960s, Porsche's road-going flat six had already proven itself as a marvel of engineering, but road cars were never the end goal for Porsche. They were merely a means to an end: racing. Because at its core, Porsche was never just a car manufacturer. It was a racing team that happened to sell road cars to fund its obsession. The flat six was about to become the beating heart of some of the most dominant race cars in history, taking on everything from endurance racing to rallying, suffering heartbreak, experiencing legendary victories, and defining Porsche's legacy in motorsports. At first, the idea of a racing 911 seemed a bit mad. Porsche had already been competing successfully with purpose-built race cars, so why bother with a rear-engined road car? But Ferry Porsche, always the pragmatist, saw potential. If the 911 could prove itself on track, it would solidify its reputation and, more importantly, sell more cars. The first major test came in 1965 at the Monte Carlo Rally. Porsche entered a lightly modified 911, going up against the mighty Mini Cooper S, which had been dominating rally stages with its front-wheel drive agility. On paper, the 911 had no chance. It was bigger, heavier, and tail-happy. But sheer reliability and the flat six's relentless power delivery saw it finish fifth overall, which was a respectable result for a new car. Then came the Nürburgring 1000 km. The 911, now with a few more racing tweaks, managed to secure class victories. proving that it had real endurance potential. But Porsche wanted more. It wanted to win outright, not just in his class, and that meant making the flat six even more potent. So, in 1967, Porsche unveiled the 911R, a stripped-down, fire-breathing version of the road car designed specifically for racing. It weighed just 800 kilograms, had an upgraded 2-liter flat-six producing 210 horsepower, and looked like a 911 that had been on a diet of pure adrenaline. It was a revelation. The 911R proved capable of hanging with much more powerful cars on technical tracks, using its superior handling and reliability to outlast the competition. Porsche knew it had something special, and so in 1969 it introduced the 911 ST, a more refined racing version that would go on to dominate endurance events, including class victories at the 24 Hours of Le Mans and the 24 Hours of Daytona. But while the 911 was making waves, Porsche had its eyes on a much bigger prize, overall victory at Le Mans, and that would require something more extreme. Now, while the 911 was proving itself, Porsche's engineers were working on something that would put the company in the history books forever, the 917. And here's where things take a slightly heartbreaking turn for the flat six. The 917 wasn't powered by a flat six. It used a monstrous 4.5-liter flat 12, essentially two six-cylinder engines welded together, producing well over 600 horsepower. It was Porsche's moonshot, designed to win Le Mans outright, and it did exactly that in 1970 and 1971. The 917 was so fast and so dominant that it cemented Porsche's place as an endurance racing powerhouse. But that doesn't mean the flat six was forgotten. In fact, it was about to stage one of its greatest comebacks in racing history. With the 917's success, Porsche had firmly established itself at the top of endurance racing. But when regulations changed in 1972, banning the big displacement prototypes, Porsche needed a new hero, and it found one in the 911 once again. Enter the 911 Carrera RSR 2.8, a hardcore racing version of the 911, featuring a heavily tuned flat six, producing 300 horsepower. It debuted in 1973 and immediately started winning everything in sight, including an overall victory at the 24 Hours of Daytona, which was an unheard of feat for a road-based car at the time. But Porsche wasn't done yet. In 1974, they took things even further with the 911 Carrera RSR Turbo, marking the first time Porsche experimented with turbocharging in endurance racing. The flat six now produced a staggering 500 horsepower, and while it didn't win Le Mans, it paved the way for something even more insane, a little car known as the Porsche 935. If the 911 RSR was a precision scalpel, the 935 was a sledgehammer. Based on the 911 Turbo, it featured a twin-turbocharged flat six capable of producing upwards of 800 horsepower in most of its extreme forms. It looked like a 911 that had been fed a steady diet of steroids and bad decisions, with an absurdly wide stance and a rear wing large enough to double as a picnic table. And this thing dominated. From 1976 to 1984, the 935 won almost everything it entered, including multiple victories at Daytona, Sebring, and Le Mans. It was so dominant that many racing teams simply gave up trying to compete. But Porsche wasn't finished rewriting history just yet. As Group C regulations took over endurance racing in the 1980s, Porsche once again went all in on the flat six. This time, it powered the Porsche 956, a purpose-built prototype featuring a 2.65-liter turbocharged flat six, producing over 600 horsepower. It introduced groundbreaking aerodynamics, including ground effect technology, and with all of this, it immediately became untouchable. The 956 won Le Mans in 1982, 1983, 1984, and 1985. It was so good that even privateer teams continued winning with it years after Porsche stopped factory support. Then came the Porsche 962, an updated version of the 956 that continued the domination into the 1990s. Between the two, they racked up 7 Le Mans victories and countless other endurance wins. making them the most successful endurance racing cars of all time. But by the late 1990s, the golden age of Porsche's turbocharged flat-six race cars was coming to an end. Regulation changes, rising costs, and new competition from manufacturers like Toyota and Mercedes meant Porsche had to rethink its approach. The final swan song of the era came with the Porsche 911 GT1, a car that looked like a stretched-out 911 but was essentially a full-blown prototype. It had a 3.2-litre twin-turbocharged flat-six, producing over 600 horsepower, and after a heartbreaking loss in 1996, it finally won Le Mans in 1998. It was a fitting end to an era where the flat-six had conquered endurance racing, proving time and time again that it wasn't just capable, it was unstoppable. But by the late 1990s, Porsche's legendary flat-six racing era seemed to be winding down. The 962 had faded into history, the 911 GT1 had won its last Le Mans in 1998, and Porsche decided to step away from top-tier endurance racing altogether. It was a bit like seeing a rock star walk off stage after decades of dominance, only to disappear into the shadows. The turbocharged monsters were gone, and Porsche, for a brief moment, seemed content with just making fast road cars. But that was never going to last, because if there is one thing history teaches us, it's that Porsche doesn't stay away from racing for long, and when it did return, the flat-six would once again take center stage. Sometimes naturally aspirated, sometimes turbocharged, sometimes even hybrid assisted, but always with that unmistakable howl. You see, with Porsche out of prototype racing, the flat-six had one primary battleground left, GT racing. The 911, Porsche's bread and butter, was still being built with a naturally aspirated flat-six, and while the world of endurance racing was shifting towards more powerful turbocharged prototypes, Porsche's focus was clear: keep refining the GT Class 911 until it was absolutely unbeatable. In 1999, Porsche introduced the 911 GT3 R, a race-bred version of the 996 generation 911, designed specifically for endurance racing. It had a 3.6-litre naturally aspirated flat-six, producing 400 horsepower, and it quickly became the go-to choice for privateer racing teams around the world. Then came the GT3 RS, the most hardcore version of the 911. Introduced in 2004, it packed a bigger 3.8-litre flat-six, producing 450 horsepower, and it proved to be a masterpiece of endurance racing engineering. It won countless GT-class victories at Le Mans, Daytona, and Sebring, proving that even without turbochargers, the flat-six was still one of the best endurance racing engines ever built. This wasn't Porsche dominating outright, like with the 962, but it was something arguably more impressive. The company had created a customer racing program that allowed privateer teams to win big on the world stage, and win they did. The 911 GT3 RS became the backbone of GT endurance racing, racking up class victories well into the 2010s. But even with all of this, Porsche was still getting a bit bored. It had conquered GT racing, and now it wanted its crown back at Le Mans. By the early 2010s, Porsche realized that it had been out of top-tier endurance racing for too long. The Audi R8 and R18 diesels had turned Le Mans into a one-man show, and Toyota had entered the fray with its hybrid prototypes. Porsche, not one to let its Volkswagen Group sibling steal all the limelight, decided to come back swinging. But first, the flat-six had to make one last stand in GT racing. Enter the Porsche 911 RS, the most extreme, naturally aspirated 911 ever built. Launched in 2013, it featured a 4-litre flat-six, producing over 500 horsepower. It was the first 911 race car with a mid-engine layout instead of the traditional rear-engine setup. It was controversial, but Porsche argued that it was necessary to keep up with the competition. And it worked. The 911 RS won its class at Le Mans multiple times, battling Ferraris Corvettes, and Aston Martins in some of the most thrilling endurance races of the decade. But while the RSR was keeping the flat six dream alive, Porsche had something much bigger in the works, something that would redefine endurance racing entirely. And here was where Porsche stepped up to the big dogs once again. You see, Porsche's return to LMP1 prototype racing was marked by the arrival of the Porsche 919 Hybrid in 2014. And while this car was mostly known for its hybrid technology, at its core was a 2-liter turbocharged V4 engine, a shocking departure from Porsche's usual flat six tradition. However, the flat six wasn't gone just yet. The 911 RSR continued to dominate GT racing, and even though the 919 Hybrid was taking the glory at Le Mans, Porsche made sure that the 911 was still winning in the GT classes year after year. The 919 Hybrid went on to win Le Mans 3 years in a row from 2015 to 2017, marking Porsche's triumphant return to prototype racing. But by 2017, the costs of running an LMP1 program had become astronomical, and Porsche, sensing the future lay elsewhere, decided to leave prototype racing once again. But just like before, that didn't mean that Porsche was done winning. With Porsche exiting the LMP1 class, the flat six once again became the star of Porsche's racing program. The company doubled down on GT racing, launching the 911 RSR 19, a completely reworked GT class car with a naturally aspirated 4.2-liter flat six, making it the largest displacement flat six in Porsche's racing history. And it was an instant hit. The RSR 19 won its class at Le Mans, Daytona, and Sebring, proving that even in an era dominated by hybrid systems and turbocharged monsters, a good old-fashioned, naturally aspirated flat six could still bring home the trophies. But why did I tell you all of this racing history? Isn't the video all about the flat six engine and the stunning cars they power? Well, yes, but here's the thing. If it wasn't for the amazing cars that the flat six powered, it wouldn't have been so iconic, specifically the GT3 RS. Now, the Porsche 911 GT3 RS isn't just a car, it's the result of 6 decades of motorsports obsession, of engineers refusing to let go of an idea even when the world told them to move on. You see, the first GT3 took everything Porsche had learned from decades of endurance racing, the high-revving, naturally aspirated flat six, the lightweight chassis, the precision handling, and distilled it into a road-legal track weapon. It had 360 horsepower from a 3.6-liter Mezger flat six, directly derived from the engines used in the 962 and GT1 race cars. From there, it was game on. Each new generation of GT3 got sharper, faster, and more focused. By the time the GT3 RS models arrived, Porsche was essentially building road-legal race cars with aerodynamic packages straight from Le Mans races. Which brings us to today, the 992 GT3 RS. This car isn't just a fast 911, it's the culmination of everything Porsche has learned over the years in racing. It has active aerodynamics inspired by a GT racing car, a 518 horsepower 4-liter naturally aspirated flat six, and a chassis so dialed in that it can lap the Nürburgring in under 7 minutes. More importantly, it carries the DNA of every racing Porsche that came before it. From the early Monte Carlo rally cars to the 935 monsters and the GT1 Le Mans winners, every bit of that history is baked into the GT3 RS. And that's why the 992 GT3 RS is quite possibly the closest thing you could buy to a race car for the road that you could actually use on a day-to-day. It's hardcore but reliable, rev-happy but quiet when it needs to be, and impossibly sticky on the road when you want to have some fun. You see, with the GT3, it's more than just how it drives, it's how it makes the driver feel. We live in an age where everything is going hybrid or electric, turbos dominate motorsports, and even endurance racing is shifting towards hybrid prototypes. But against all odds, Porsche's still out here building naturally aspirated, high-revving, 6-cylinder screamers, where you can feel the motorsports pedigree pumping through the car's veins. The GT3 RS isn't just a great car, it's a middle finger to modern automotive trends, a reminder that Porsche's greatest achievements weren't just about turbochargers and hybrid systems, they were about lightweight, high-revving race-bred machines that put driving above everything else. And as long as Porsche keeps making cars like this, the legacy of the Flat 6, born on the racetrack, tested in endurance battles, and perfected over decades, will never die. But at the end of this quite long video, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and if you guys enjoyed this video, please have a like and subscribe to the channel. If you guys did like this video, you'll most probably enjoy most of my other stuff, so just go through my channel, see if it's someone else like, or check you guys in the next one. Cheers,